The GoPro is an amazing action camera capable of capturing high-quality footage. If you own a GoPro, chances are you want to capture footage that you can share on social media or with family and friends. And most importantly, you want that footage to look good. However, you may have found that sometimes the footage that you capture does not look good at all. The footage may be dark, the footage may have jitter, ghosting, or the footage just may look weird when you export it. The good news is there are changes you can make to your GoPro right now to immediately improve the quality of your footage. I've used GoPro action cameras for more than 10 years now, and I've learned a lot about these cameras over the years. And most importantly, I've learned how to get the very best videos from these cameras. So grab your favorite GoPro. In my case, I have the Hero 13 right here, and let's dive in. Now, it is important to note up front that most of these tips will apply to most GoPros. It won't apply to all, but most of the settings will be available on at least the Hero 9 or newer. So if you own a Hero 9, Hero 10, Hero 11, Hero 12, or Hero 13, most of these settings will be an option for you. So the first thing you need to do, and it's very important, is you need to make sure you have the right microSD card for your GoPro. Fortunately, GoPro makes this really easy. On their website, GoPro lists the recommended microSD card for each and every GoPro model. So check your GoPro model and then look at this table and then check your microSD card and make sure your microSD card meets or exceeds the specifications that GoPro lists for your camera. The reason having the right microSD card is so important is your microSD card has to have fast enough read and write speeds to keep up with the GoPro as it's writing to that microSD card. If it doesn't, the GoPro is going to either not record at all, or it's going to record, but it's going to record in a lower bitrate. And if you don't have the right microSD card, the chances are high that you could lose that footage, or the footage is just going to look terrible. With my GoPros, I personally use the SanDisk Extreme, but in the Hero 13, I like to use the SanDisk Extreme Pro. And one other tip on this, make sure you buy from a legitimate retailer. There have been reports of a lot of fake microSD cards out there, so make sure you buy from a retailer where you can be sure you're getting a legitimate card. The next thing you'll want to check in your GoPro is you'll want to make sure Pro Mode is turned on. This is a setting in the main menu on newer GoPros, and when you turn on Pro Mode, it unlocks a lot of different settings that you can customize, and a lot of those settings are going to be key later on to getting the best results. If you own an older GoPro, don't worry about it, you're already in Pro Mode. GoPro didn't have a standard or Pro Mode until a few years ago. So this is something, if you own a newer GoPro, definitely check in your main menu. Since we're talking about improvement and how to do things better, I'd like to take a moment to tell you about an improvement I've made in my own life during the year 2025. Over the past few years, as I've worked hard on creating content for this channel, I've found that it can be challenging to focus throughout that process. That process has many steps, and they can take many hours. Coming up with ideas, writing down those ideas, filming, editing, and publishing, there's a lot of work involved. And sometimes I find it's also challenging to get good sleep at night after those long editing sessions. So one of my focuses in 2025 is on mental wealth. Mental wealth is all about proactively investing in good habits today that will create resilience for future challenges. And there are 5 key pillars to mental wealth. These include sleep, diet, exercise, stress management, and exogenous compounds. And to help support my focus on mental wealth, I've recently started using Magic Mind. I first discovered Magic Mind when Magic Mind reached out to me and invited me to test out a few of their shots to see if they would work for me before sponsoring a video of mine. Magic Mind is a product that was created with a scientific advisory board of doctors and medical researchers and has over 200 scientific studies behind every ingredient in these shots. Magic Mind has been a useful tool in helping me enhance my focus and improve my sleep as part of a bigger focus on mental wealth. Tools like Magic Mind are the little things that help me move in the right direction. For 24 hours of mental performance, I use the focus shots in the morning. These help me with daytime focus, clarity, a sharper mind, less stress, and most importantly, clean energy. In the evening before bed, I use the sleep shots for falling asleep faster and sleeping deeper. For the first time, Magic Mind is offering 24-hour packs. This pack includes both the focus and sleep shots bundled together for a 45% discount. Using my link in the description below. I encourage each of you to take some time and focus on your own mental wealth investments. Consider making 2025 the year that you build your own mental resilience. So the next thing we want to do in our GoPro is we want to make sure the bitrate is set to high. Older GoPros do not have this option, but newer ones do have a setting where you can either select standard or high bitrate. You definitely want the highest bitrate possible because the highest bitrate is going to translate to more detail and clarity in your footage. And this detail and clarity is really important because after you edit your footage and export it, the higher the bitrate, the better quality that footage will look when you upload it to YouTube. There's going to be less compression there. And you probably know what I mean by compression artifacts if you've seen your own or other people's GoPros. Compression artifacts look really bad. They're blocky in the video and it almost makes the video unwatchable. Now the next thing you want to do is you want to make sure you're recording in the highest quality resolution possible. So for older GoPros, this is going to be 4K, and for the newer GoPros, it's going to be 5.3K. And with the newer GoPros, even if you're not going to share your final product in 5.3K, you still want to film in 5.3K and then export as 4K. 5.3K has 91% more resolution than 4K, which is a lot. Resolution does not scale linearly, it does scale exponentially when you look at it that way. And what I love to do is I love to film in 5.3K and export as 4K. But if you do film in 4K, I still highly recommend exporting as 4K and not as 1080p. If you export as 1080p and upload to YouTube, YouTube is going to apply more compression and use different codecs for that final product, and it's not going to look even close to as good as if you upload in 4K. 4K uploads are going to use different codecs and they're going to have less compression on YouTube, and they're going to look a lot better. When setting your sharpness, make sure you use low or medium, but do not ever set your sharpness to high. Setting your sharpness to high in the GoPro is going to look really bad in pretty much any scenario. But if you want an easy way to know when you should use low or when you should use medium, here's a few tips for that. If you're in the woods where there's a lot of trees and a lot of leaves, or if you're in a field where there's a lot of grass, generally you're going to want to set your sharpness to low, because if you have it at medium, it can really focus on those leaves and that grass and it can make them look extra sharp, which doesn't tend to look as good in those scenes as low. You kind of want the detail on those not over sharpened. You want it a little bit softer in your scene. It's going to look better. And of course, when you're editing, you can always add some sharpness later on selectively if you use low. Medium sharpness is generally good in a scene that doesn't have a lot of detail or a lot of contrast. So if you're on a snowy ski slope and you're going down the mountains and you just have the ski slope and the sky behind you, that's a great place to use medium. In addition, if you're on the water, that's also a great place to use medium for the sharpness. Now, if you have a newer GoPro that has the 10-bit color option, you definitely want to use 10-bit. And here's why. 10-bit color offers 1 billion, with a B, possible color shades. But if you use 8-bit, 8-bit only offers 16 million color shades. So 1 billion versus 16 million, that is a huge difference. And it's definitely noticeable if you're filming anything like skies, where there's a gradual fade of color, especially at sunset, where you have that ombre pattern. If you have 8-bit, the sky is going to tend to look bandy. There's going to be bands there. But if you're using 10-bit, it's going to be a nice smooth gradient, and it's really going to enhance the quality of your footage. It's going to look a lot better. So if you do have the 10-bit setting, definitely use it. Now, when it comes to selecting the color mode, older GoPros have just 2 color modes. They generally have flat or vivid. And with those, if you're going to do any grading later on, I recommend using flat. If you're not, use the vivid. But if you have a newer GoPro, those are generally going to have 3 different modes. They're generally going to be natural, and natural is going to be that middle of the road mode where everything should look pretty natural to what the environment looks like. And natural is a good mode to use if you don't want to do any color grading later on. That's generally going to be the go-to mode. But if you want to do grading later on, if you own a newer GoPro, I recommend using GP Log. It's going to give you the most flexibility. And GP Log is essentially the same as flat, but it's even flatter than flat. So there's even less contrast in color there, and it really gives you a lot of flexibility to grade that really nicely later on. But one exception to that is if you are in an environment that I mentioned earlier, where there's not a lot of contrast, let's say a ski slope, a place where you'd want to use medium sharpness, sometimes using vivid for the color there can actually help bring out more contrast and detail in your scene. So it's one of those tricks that I recommend trying if you're doing a ski slope or if you're on the water. Vivid can help give you an even better looking video footage in those scenes. When setting your ISO min and maximum values, I recommend setting the ISO min to 100 and then setting the ISO max to 800. Ideally, you want your ISO sitting as close to 100 as possible at all times. ISO 100 is going to yield the highest quality footage with the least amount of noise and grain in that footage. But your GoPro is going to constantly be adjusting the ISO and the shutter speed as it's seeking to get that balanced exposure for whatever scene you're filming, so do keep that in mind. But the reason I don't recommend setting your ISO max above ISO 800 is a GoPro can quickly get a lot of noise and grain at ISO 1600 and above, and that footage essentially becomes unusable. It just looks terrible. Even if you have a denoising plugin later on, that poor denoising plugin can only do so much when the noise and grain gets that bad. So I recommend maxing out at ISO 800. This next one is a really important one, and one of those secrets that can really help you get the best looking footage. So when possible, when you're filming with your GoPro, it's best to keep the sun behind you. So what I mean is wherever you're filming, keep the sun at your back, and it can be a 45-degree angle over either shoulder. That works great too. But try not to ever point your GoPro toward the sun when filming a scene. And the reason for that is your GoPro is going to be adjusting exposure for that scene, and the sun is going to be the brightest object by far in your scene. And what it's going to do is it's going to try to expose the sun properly. But when you do that, the rest of your scene is going to look really dark. If you've ever done this, you definitely know what I'm talking about. And when the rest of your scene adapts to the brightness of the sun and everything else looks dark, it can be really hard to fix that later on when editing. Usually that gets baked into your footage. There is a way to somewhat offset this if your scene does require you to face toward the sun, and I'm going to talk about that next. And the other reason you want to face away from the sun is when you're facing the sun, you're usually going to get a lens flare on the GoPro lens, and the lens flare is usually not one that enhances the quality of the footage. Unlike those lens flares you've seen in some of the J.J. Abrams movies, the GoPro lens flare is generally not a good quality to have in your footage. So the way you can offset this if you have to face the sun is you can use exposure control. And the older GoPros, this was called spot meter, and the newer GoPros, it's called exposure control. And what this does is you can tap and hold on the screen, and you're going to see a box that pops up. And what you want to do with that box is you want to drag it around for whatever part of your scene you want to expose properly. So if you were facing the sun, you can drag that box around and make sure the box is not over the sun, unless you really want the sun properly exposed and the rest of your scene to essentially look like nighttime. But let's say you were biking toward the sun and you had your camera pointed toward the sun, you would want to probably expose in the lower half of your scene. So maybe you're on a road, maybe you're on a trail. You would want to drag that box around, and then when you have it set to the lower part of your screen, you just want to tap the check mark, and it's going to lock the exposure to that part of the scene. So unless you lift up your GoPro where that exposure box is going to line up with the sun, it's going to keep a general good exposure for your scene. And the sun, of course, is going to be overexposed, but that's fine because it's pretty normal for the sun to be overexposed in a video. But the rest of your scene is going to look great. So this next one is a big one, low light. If you've owned a GoPro, even if for a couple weeks, and you've tried to film in low lighting, you've probably not been happy with how your footage looks. And chances are you've had jitter and ghosting in your footage, and jitter and ghosting looks terrible, and footage is basically unusable when that's baked into it. So the reason you don't get good footage in low lighting by default is because GoPro uses Hypersmooth. And Hypersmooth is the stabilization that's a form of EIS. And EIS stands for Electronic Image Stabilization. And the problem with electronic image stabilization is it does need sharp enough frames in order to stabilize the footage properly. When you're in low light and moving around with your GoPro is doing this, and the Hypersmooth is trying to stabilize and match up those frames. But what happens in that lower light is the GoPro slows down your shutter speed in order to get as close as possible to a balanced exposure. And when the shutter speed slows down to about 1/200 or slower, there begins to be a lot of motion blur in your scene. And the problem with that motion blur is Hypersmooth cannot see those frames sharp enough to properly line up everything in those frames. So even though it can stabilize the footage, there's going to be that jitter and ghosting from the slower shutter speed. It's going to look very wobbly and almost like those photos you see where there's a long exposure. Your footage, anything moving in it, is essentially going to be dragging around a long exposure plume behind it. But the good news is there are a few different ways to address this. If your situation does allow you to use a gimbal, I recommend using the Hohem iSteady Pro 4 right here. I've used this gimbal with a variety of GoPros for many years now, and this gimbal is very budget friendly. It costs less than $100 and it works really well. It's simple to use, you don't have to do any balancing, you just pop your GoPro on, you turn it on, you're good to go. And that gimbal is enough to prevent some of the micro shakes that cause jitter and ghosting on your camera. It alleviates that problem. Now, if using a gimbal isn't an option, then the next thing you want to consider is you want to consider adding light to your scene. A good flashlight or headlamp can go a long way because that's going to give enough lighting to your GoPro that it can have a higher shutter speed in order to expose that scene properly. So like if I'm walking around in a tunnel or in the woods at nighttime, if I have a headlamp on that has at least 1,000 or 2,000 lumens for the brightness, it's generally going to be more than enough to prevent any jitter or ghosting in my footage. And of course, if your GoPro isn't moving, if you have it set stationary on a tripod, you don't have to worry about this because as long as your GoPro's not moving, anything in your scene that's moving is not going to be affected by this. It's only when your GoPro itself is moving. And finally, a third option for addressing this, if you're not able to use a gimbal and you don't want to provide more lighting, you can manually adjust your shutter speed to a high enough value that you won't have to worry about the jitter and ghosting. If you're filming in 24 frames per second, generally a shutter speed of 1/192 is going to be fast enough that you won't have jitter and ghosting. And if you're filming in 30 frames per second, a shutter speed of 1/240 is going to be fast enough that you don't have to worry about jitter and ghosting. But I have found that sometimes at 24 frames per second, if you have enough lighting in your scene, 1/96 can be the sweet spot. 1/96 is a slower shutter speed, but if there is enough lighting, even if it's not the brightest light, it sometimes can be enough to prevent any jitter and ghosting. But do keep in mind, if you manually set a shutter speed of 1/192 and 1/240, it does let in a lot less light than if you had a shutter speed of 1/48 or 1/60. So there is a trade-off there to consider. And also keep in mind, the scenario you're filming in will make a difference with this. If you're in the woods and it's shady, but it's during the daytime, setting your shutter speed manually to 1/192 or 1/240 is probably not going to be a problem. You're probably going to have enough light there that your exposure isn't going to look too dark. But if it is in low light at nighttime, then that 1/192 or 1/240 is probably going to be too fast of a shutter speed, and it's probably going to look too dark unless you have plenty of man-made light in that scene, like a flashlight, headlamp, or city lights. So the next thing to consider is consider what stabilization setting you use. Now, some of the really old GoPros have no stabilization built in at all, and you need to use the gyro data later on to stabilize the footage. But if you own a newer GoPro, it's going to have Hypersmooth on it. And on the newest GoPros, you do have Hypersmooth Standard, High, and Auto Boost. As a general rule, you want to use Hypersmooth Standard unless you're in a really intense action speed where using High or Auto Boost would be justified. The reason you don't want to use High or Auto Boost unless you have to is High or Auto Boost introduces a crop into your footage, and that crop is going to lower the quality of your footage because you're going to be capturing less of that frame that the sensor's capturing. It's going to be zoomed in on that, and the resolution is going to be a little bit more fuzzy and not as sharp. And on that same note, speaking of zooming in, don't use zoom on your GoPro camera. Because it's digital zoom, it's going to automatically lower the quality of your footage by quite a bit. What I always recommend doing, like I mentioned earlier, is film in the highest resolution possible. And then when you're editing later on, if you want to crop that scene a little bit, that's the time to zoom in. And that way you're not going to have that zoom baked into the footage. You're going to be able to zoom just as much as you need to, but not more than you need to. Another important aspect to getting great quality footage is understand the minimum focal distance on your GoPro. Each GoPro has a minimum focus distance of about 12 inches. So what that means is to have anything in focus on your GoPro, you need to have your GoPro back at least 12 inches from that object. And as a general rule, I like to stay back at least 18 inches. I find that 12 inches can sometimes be a little bit out of focus still, but if you're back at least 18 inches from whatever you're capturing, it's going to be in focus and you're not going to have any problems. This is especially important to note if you're holding the GoPro and talking to it. You want to make sure you have this on a good selfie stick or pole that you can hold back at least that 18 or so inches from your face. You're not going to be happy with your results if you're talking to the GoPro and your face is out of focus, but the background's in focus. It's going to look really bad. The next thing you want to make sure you're doing when filming with your GoPro is you want to make sure you're using the proper field of view. And really that proper field of view is going to come down to what you're capturing in your scene. Some scenes you may want to use wide, ultra wide, or even hyperview. Hyperview is a mode that's available on the newest GoPros, and hyperview is basically a highly distorted but very POV type mode. Hyperview mode is great for very immersive footage, but it would not be great if you're trying to vlog and talk to your camera. It would not look great for that type of setting. But if you're doing intense action or downhill skiing, something like that, the POV could be cool for some of those scenes, or mountain biking, it could be great for that as well. But there are other scenes where you may want to use a linear field of view, and that's going to be if you're in a city oftentimes, because linear prevents that fisheye distortion. So if you want the buildings to be straight up and down and not bowing in like this, linear or linear plus is a great option to use. And on the newer GoPros, linear plus has horizon lock and horizon leveling, depending upon the resolution and frame rate you're filming in. And it is possible to film 5.3K footage with that full horizon lock on some of the newer GoPros if you're in linear plus mode. So it's definitely worth experimenting with if you want to do so. But definitely think about that field of view ahead of time before you're filming your scenes, because it really can affect the feel of your scene, and you want that field of view to line up with the story that you're trying to tell. And finally, when filming, make sure that you film in the frames per second that your finished product is going to be, unless you want a particular scene to be slow motion. So what I mean by that is if your final timeline when you're editing and exporting is going to be 30 frames per second, make sure you film all your footage in the 30 frames per second, unless you want a scene to be slow motion, in which case you would want to film that in 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second. 60 frames per second will allow you to slow it down 2 times, and 120 frames per second will allow you to slow it down 4 times. And if you want your finished product to be in 24 frames per second, same thing. Film as many clips as possible in the 24 frames per second, unless you want to slow it down later on, in which case you could use 60 or 120. The reason you want to do this is this will help ensure the shutter speed matches your finished product later on, and it's going to help prevent stutter that you can sometimes see in a video if it doesn't. It can be subtle sometimes, but other times it can really stand out, especially if you have your GoPro panning a lot. It's going to look pretty bad in those situations. It's not going to be as noticeable if you're moving forwards or backwards, but sideways, it's definitely going to be noticeable there. So if you'd like to learn more about getting incredible footage with GoPros, check out my GoPro Essentials playlist right here. This playlist is packed with lots of videos that teach you how to get the very best from your GoPro action camera.